The story that you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts, featuring characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI descended on the Branch Davidian compound known as Mount Carmel in search of illegally amassed weapons as seen on national news stations around the globe. They witnessed the initial shootout between the two sides transform into a 51-day standoff, as well as the botched talks that resulted in photos of people ready to arm themselves and battle a tyrannical government to the death. Then, on April 19, 1993, federal agents rammed armored vehicles into the fortified building as flames engulfed religious cult leader David Koresh and over 75 of his men, women, and child followers. Most died in the smoke and fire with their beliefs that the world would end, a fulfilled prophecy of sorts. Koresh was born Vernon Wayne Howell on August 17, 1959 in Houston, Texas, to a 14-year-old single mother, Bonnie Sue Clark, who became pregnant with him after sleeping with a 20-year-old carpenter named Bobby Howell. The pair remained unmarried. 2 years later, his father met another woman and left. He never knew his father and was raised by a harsh stepfather. Koresh described his early childhood as lonely, and it has been alleged that he was once raped by older boys. By the age of 12, however, he had learned the New Testament by heart. Due to his poor study skills and dyslexia, he was put in special education classes and nicknamed Vernie by his fellow students. Koresh dropped out of Garland High School in his junior year to take a carpentry job. When he was 19, Koresh had an affair with a 16-year-old girl who became pregnant but left him because she considered him unfit to raise a child. He then became a born-again Christian in the Southern Baptist Church, but soon joined his mother's church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. There, Koresh became infatuated with the pastor's daughter, and while praying for guidance, he opened his eyes and allegedly found the Bible open at Isaiah 34:16, stating that none should want for her mate. Convinced this was a sign from God, Koresh approached the pastor and told him that God wanted him to have his daughter for a wife. The pastor threw him out, and when he continued to persist with his pursuit of the daughter, he was expelled from the congregation. In his early 20s, he spent a short time in Los Angeles trying to make it as a rock star. He rejoined the Seventh-day Adventist after returning to Texas, but was kicked out after butting heads with church leaders. In 1981, Koresh moved to Waco, Texas, where he joined the Branch Davidians, not to be confused with the original Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Church. In 1983, Koresh began claiming the gift of prophecy. He had an affair with the sect's much older prophetess, Louise Roden, the widow of Benjamin Roden and leader of the cult, who was then in her late 60s. Koresh eventually began to claim that God had chosen him to father a child with Lois, who would be the chosen one. Lois allowed Koresh to begin teaching his own message called the Serpent's Root, which caused controversy in the group. Lois's son, George Roden, intended to be the group's next leader and considered Koresh an interloper. When Koresh announced that God had instructed him to marry Rachel Jones, who then added Koresh to her name, a period of calm ensued at the Mount Carmel Center, but it proved only temporary. A fire destroyed a $500,000 administration building and press. Roden said Koresh started the fire, but Koresh replied that no man set that fire and that it was a judgment of God. Roden, claiming to have the support of the majority of the cult, forced Koresh and his group off the property at gunpoint. Koresh and around 25 followers set up camp at Palestine, Texas, 90 miles from Waco, where they lived under rough conditions in buses and tents for the next 2 years. During this time, Koresh undertook recruitment of new followers in California, the United Kingdom, Israel, and Australia. That same year, he traveled to Israel where he claimed he had a vision that he was the modern-day Cyrus. At the Palestine, Texas camp, Koresh worked it so that everyone was forced to rely on him and him alone. All previous bonds and attachments, family or otherwise, meant nothing. His rationale was if they had no one to depend on, they had to depend on him, and that made them vulnerable. By this time, he had already begun to give the message of his own Christhood, proclaiming that he was the Son of God, the Lamb who could open the seven seals in the book of Revelation, which predicted events leading to the apocalypse. He told his followers that the Lord willed the Davidians to build an army of God. As a result, they started stockpiling weapons. Louis Roden died in 1986. Up until now, Koresh had been teaching that monogamy was the only way to live, but suddenly announced that polygamy was allowed for him. In March 1986, Koresh first slept with Karen Doyle, aged 14. He claimed her as his second wife. In August 1986, Koresh began secretly sleeping with Michelle Jones, his wife's younger 12-year-old sister. In September 1986, Koresh began to preach that he was entitled to 140 wives, 60 women as his queens, and 80 as concubines, which he based upon his interpretation of the biblical Song of Solomon. Koresh then built up an entirely new theology around his marriage to Doyle. This theology was called the New Light, with a doctrine of polygamy for himself, which he called the House of David. According to this doctrine, Doyle was supposed to have a daughter named Shoshana, who would then be married to Koresh's firstborn son Cyrus. Doyle failed to conceive, however, so Koresh then transferred his attention to his wife's sister. Former Davidian David Mons said that Koresh's doctrine of polygamy rose out of his deep desire to have sex with young girls. Once he was able to convince himself that it was God's will, then he was able to be free of guilt and have sex with as many young girls as he could get his hands on. By late 1987, George Roden's support had withered. To regain it, he challenged Koresh to a contest to raise the dead, even digging up one corpse to practice on it. Koresh returned to Mount Carmel in camouflage with 7 armed followers. All but one, who managed to escape, were arrested by the local police who had been alerted by the sound of gunfire. When deputy sheriffs arrived and ended the shootout, they found Koresh and 6 followers firing their rifles at Roden, who had already suffered a minor gunshot wound and was pinned down behind a tree at the compound. As a result of the incident, Koresh and his followers were charged with attempted murder. At the trial, Koresh testified that he went to Mount Carmel to uncover evidence of corpse abuse by George Roden. Koresh's followers were acquitted, and in Koresh's case, a mistrial was declared. In 1989, Roden murdered Raymond Dale Adair with an axe blow to the skull after Adair stated his belief that he himself was the true Messiah. Roden was judged insane and confined to a psychiatric hospital at Big Spring, Texas. Since Roden owed thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes on the Mount Carmel Center, Koresh and his followers were able to raise the money and reclaim the property. Roden continued to harass the Koresh faction by filing legal papers while imprisoned. When Koresh and his followers reclaimed the Mount Carmel Center, they discovered that tenants who had rented from Roden had left behind a meth lab, which Koresh reported to the local police department and asked to have removed. Vernon Howell filed a petition in California State Superior Court in Pomona on May 15, 1990, to legally change his name for publicity and business purposes to David Koresh. On August 28, 1990, Judge Robert Martinez granted the petition. Koresh is the biblical name of Cyrus the Great, a Persian king, who is named a Messiah for freeing Jews during the Babylonian captivity. His first name David symbolized a lineage directly to the biblical King David, from whom the new Messiah would descend. By taking the name of David Koresh, he was professing himself to be the spiritual descendant of King David, a messianic figure carrying out a divinely commissioned errand. Koresh's teachings included the practice of spiritual weddings, which enabled him to bed God-chosen female followers of all ages. Koresh took several wives at Mount Carmel and fathered at least 12 children from these women, several of whom were as young as 12 or 13 when they became pregnant. There is also evidence that Koresh may have harshly disciplined some of the 100 or so Branch Davidians living inside the compound, particularly his children. A central aspect of Koresh's religious teaching was his assertion that the apocalyptic events predicted in the Bible's book of Revelation were imminent, making it necessary, he asserted, for the Davidians to stockpile weapons and explosives in preparation. Koresh was alleged to have been involved in multiple incidents of physical and sexual abuse of children. His doctrine of the House of David did lead to marriages with both married and single women in the Branch Davidians. This doctrine was based on a purported revelation that involved the procreation of 24 children by chosen women in the community. These 24 children were to serve as the ruling elders over the millennium after the return of Christ. These women purportedly chosen through this doctrine included at least one underage girl, Michelle Jones, who was the younger 12-year-old sister of Koresh's legal wife Rachel and the daughter of lifelong Branch Davidians Perry and Mary Bell Jones. A 6-month investigation of sexual abuse allegations by the Texas Child Protection Services in 1992 failed to turn up any evidence, possibly because the Branch Davidians concealed the spiritual marriage of Koresh to Michelle, assigning a surrogate husband to the girl for the sake of appearances. On February 28, 1993, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, citing evidence that cult members were amassing illegal weapons, tried to execute a warrant on the Branch Davidian at Mount Carmel. A 4-hour gunfight left 6 of Koresh's followers and 4 BATF agents dead, leading to a 51-day standoff between Koresh and federal agents. 6 Branch Davidians were fatally wounded, and several more were injured, including David Koresh, the cult's founder and leader. After 45 minutes of shooting, the ATF agents withdrew and a ceasefire was negotiated over the phone. Shortly after the initial raid, the FBI hostage rescue team took command of the federal operation because the FBI has jurisdiction over incidents involving the death of federal agents. The negotiating team established contact with Koresh inside the compound. Communication over the next 51 days included telephone exchanges with various FBI negotiators. As the standoff continued, Koresh, who was seriously injured by a gunshot wound, along with his closest male leaders, negotiated delays, possibly so he could write religious documents he said he needed to complete before he surrendered. His conversations with the negotiators were dense with biblical imagery. The federal negotiators treated the situation as a hostage crisis, despite a 2-hour videotape sent out by the Davidians in which the adults and older children or teens appeared to explain clearly and confidently why they chose of their own free will to remain with David. The FBI negotiators treated the situation as a hostage crisis. 21 children aged from 5 months to 12 years were released from Mount Carmel over a 3-day period at the beginning of the siege. These children were placed in the custody of the Child Protective Services and housed together in a single cottage. Over the next 2 months, these children were in the constant care of a multidisciplinary treatment team consisting of child care and mental health professionals from a variety of institutions and organizations who carried out extensive evaluation and assessment. They concluded that the children had been raised in an abusive setting and that Koresh's regime at Mount Carmel was clearly a psychologically destructive environment for children. Koresh deliberately undermined the traditional parent-child relationship and replaced it with a dependence upon a central figure, himself. The children related at various times that they had been instructed to call their natural parents dogs and to call Koresh father. Children who were not biologically Koresh's or adopted by Koresh were called bastards. Koresh continuously undermined all relationships within the Branch Davidian community, including sibling relationships, husband and wife relationships, and friendships. Any attachment judged by Koresh to be more important to an individual than the dependence upon him or God was not tolerated. By 1992, the children were being taught to view Koresh as their father, and soon after, they were taught that he was God. The children demonstrated inappropriate and age-inappropriate behaviors and significant gaps in general understanding, reflecting practices present in the compound. Very young children, including a 6-year-old girl, knew an incredible amount about weapons while they knew almost nothing about common age-appropriate concepts. Child psychologists concluded that the children were significantly traumatized by previous harsh and inappropriate disciplinary techniques, including severe corporal punishment, extended isolation, and severe food restrictions. They were continually exposed to harsh, capricious, and humiliating disciplinary techniques. Children as young as 8 months were beaten for trivial matters, and older children were beaten for not fighting hard enough in bouts arranged by Koresh between the children as part of their paramilitary training. The children were also threatened with death if they revealed aspects of life inside the compound to the non-believers. As is typical when an abusive adult threatens a child, they were told that outsiders would not understand our special ways. The children were convinced that Koresh would return from the grave and punish them if they betrayed the Davidians by interacting with or disclosing information to the bad guys, like law enforcement and non-Davidians. Koresh was exploitive and manipulative of children and exposed them to a variety of inappropriate sexual content, such as graphically describing intercourse and sexual technique and his hours-long sermons at which the children were present. Furthermore, the girls were socialized to believe that sex with Koresh by age 11 or 12 was normal, appropriate, and desirable as part of God's plan as revealed to and by Koresh. All of the young girls were being prepared to be his wives and to view that as a healthy and desired position to be in. One of the older girls expressed distress, now that she had been released from the compound, that she would not be able to be picked by Koresh as one of his brides. Koresh created an environment which had an unhealthy, malignant, and predatory quality of sexuality, and all of the girls were groomed for sexual activity at an early age. Then, on April 19, 1993, national news teams captured footage of the government using military-grade tear gas in the Fury compound, where over 75 people died, a third of them children. Koresh was among those who were shot by their fellow cult members. Few survived the carnage. 4 months after Waco, a federal grand jury indicted 12 Davidians for aiding and abetting the murder of agents and illegally possessing firearms. 4 were acquitted, 8 were acquitted of murder but served varying sentences on firearms-related offenses. By 2007, everyone was out of prison. In recent years, the Davidians renamed themselves The Branch, the Lord Our Righteousness, and built a new church in Waco, just east of the former Mount Carmel compound. Charles Pace became the new leader and, like his predecessor in Koresh, declared himself the new Lamb of God of Revelations.
Hi, this is Twysted Mind. Quick question for you. Do you like reading romantic stories? If so, in the description box below is a link to an app called Dreame that features a writer under the pseudonym of Annabel Lee. Please click and follow her. Thank you.
Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took the time to listen to my narration. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am Twysted Mind and please enjoy the rest of your day. Salamat!